Hey, Through the Noise podcast. I'm your host, Ernesto Glucksman. Have you ever looked at one of those weird installations with fans and an array, and they're like pushing air, and it's supposed to be capturing carbon into something with like this big machine behind it, these sort of cutting edge technologies, but you don't really know if they're for real? Well, my next guest is from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. He's a senior policy analyst, and it was his job to go dig deep into what that stuff is and what we need to do as a country to adjust our policies to stimulate the growth of exactly that: direct air, carbon capture, and carbon capture sequestration. These are all of these terms that are just a little bit complicated to wrap your heads around, but Stefan does a really nice job getting us there. So let's get into the episode. All right, Stefan, man, thank you for joining me on the show. I'm eager. I'm even pulling up my chair. Just I wanted to get a chance to talk to somebody whose job it is to understand the implications from the technology and the policy side and try to summarize this world, right, that you're in. So but given the nature of the audience that I have, it's probably best to ask you the simple question. Like, when someone sits down with you for dinner, right, and they don't know anything about you, and they ask you, "So, Stefan, what do you do for a living? What do you give? What do you start with? Where's the zone you get into?"
Thanks, Ernesto. Yeah, I think sitting down with dinner with strangers, certainly the topic of technology and what I do at the Information Technology Innovation Foundation. I don't know if it always comes up, but if it were to, I would certainly try to highlight the fact that we in the United States and globally are at a really interesting inflection point where we feel as if the technology that we have available to solve a lot of the collective action problems, a lot of the economic, social, health and safety, internet communications issues are available and they're at scale, and an opportunity for us as a society and economy to really invest in those. But there's also these what we call unrealized potential technologies out there that we don't want to lose sight of in both public policy as well as in the ways in which, for example, corporates invest in research and development and so forth. So me specifically, I focus on climate technology with the goal of designing and developing and helping companies and helping policymakers understand what's available, what we still need to perfect and design to solve the climate crisis, which we take as a very serious crisis. Both for the fact that it's going to impact everyone who lives on planet Earth, as well as the economic impacts of unmitigated climate change. So we take that very seriously. But we feel like technology has, if not the central role, then a very strong supporting role in helping us achieve what we see and what the science tells us is necessary to reduce emissions in time by mid-century, essentially.
So, I mean, you would consider yourself a technologist. I feel like that's a new term that's suddenly coming back right into a role here. You have faith in the technologies there.
Certainly, yeah. I would definitely consider myself a technologist. Within the climate space, it's a space that I've been in for about a decade now, and I've been lucky in that time frame to see the ebbs and flows of various attempts at developing both national and international climate strategies. And of course, many of them were heavily in the early stages were very market-based, very market-oriented. Of course, I'm talking about the cap and trade and Waxman-Markey, which was a large congressional effort to institute a national cap and trade program in 2009. and that failed. There was a lot of discontent amongst the environmental community for that. And then I've also been involved more sort of in the more advocate side, you would say, where there's folks, sort of the groundswell of public resistance to fossil fuel infrastructure, for example, protests, efforts by environmental groups to, for example, get large investment companies to divest from fossil infrastructure and so forth. So those are two ways I think of thinking about and trying to address the climate crisis. But I think something that we shouldn't lose track of and we shouldn't take for granted is the vital role that technology will play in all of that.
Okay. So, I mean, give us some grounding, yeah, cap and trade to me. I mean, I'm a believer that a carbon tax would be the stick that would motivate a lot of new markets, right? It would create, that's just my opinion. I'm not an expert in this world, but the cap and trade, I don't really know what went down in terms of like the complexity associated with any of that, but it seems like they try one thing on a policy side that doesn't quite work out, then they go after a different direction, right? And so, but in the end, what's maybe missed is how do we actually get investment into scaling some of these things, right? And for a little while, I think this just, I'm giving you my background and how I've been perceiving this. Maybe you can then give me some insights on what you think about this. But for a little while, I didn't really follow along what was happening. Maybe some despondency, like I was like, well, eventually the climate will cause enough issues that somehow will stimulate everyone to get serious. But surprisingly enough to me, I came across the Tesla story and what Elon Musk, and I know his name is like contentious now for Twitter and other reasons, but to see actually go from zero to at scale, millions of units that are not going to use fossil fuels, that possibility even existed. That's just an astounding story to get into. So I'm curious where you think stories like that can happen in other spots, right? Because that's not the only, getting the transportation sector into, mostly battery operated. That's not the end all solution here. That's just that's like a stone into the bigger picture of what we have to do.
Right. Yeah, thanks. That's a good point. And just really briefly on the Elon Musk Tesla sort of success story. Obviously, Tesla is the largest manufacturer and producer and seller of electric vehicles today, and they've certainly taken a huge market role. But what shouldn't be forgotten is the vital role that government-funded research and development played in that in the early stages of designing the lithium-ion battery, for example, came out of the United States investment in our national labs, particularly our energy labs, both in the 90s and through the early 2000s. So lowering those costs as well. And of course, Tesla was also supported by public policy in the form of the federal CAFE standards, which provided an extra revenue stream for their electric vehicle credits that they were able to monetize. So
we should qualify. We should be specific about that. Wasn't just to Tesla. That was to like anybody who wanted to make this type of car.
Correct. Yeah.
Just happened to be that Tesla took advantage of it.
Correct. Yeah. I don't mean, Tesla was able to take advantage of that alongside other, even Toyota, for example, every time they sold fuel efficient hybrids and so forth. So, but yeah, I mean, I think Tesla's a good example. And, we at ITIF, we said it before, if we're really going to solve the climate crisis in a way that allows for both continued economic growth in the United States and around the world, and allows for essentially sort of an equitable transition, we're going to need a million Tesla-like companies to bloom. And we need to be able to create the infrastructure to support that in the United States, because we do see this as a big climate opportunity in the sense that these companies, we see this today as a lot of traditional car manufacturers are clearly seeing the need to invest in electric vehicles as the future. So we certainly want to see the United States lead in that world. But we need to let a thousand flowers bloom there for sure.
Now, one of the areas that I haven't gone into too much, but I'm working my way through there, is I wanted to know more about carbon capture and carbon sequestration, because it's just that's like totally separate from the auto industry in general. It's that I think I came across one of these companies from, I think, a Bill Gates mentioning it in his either blog post or something. And I looked at it and it was like an array of fans. I guess that's direct air capture. Is that what they mean by direct air capture? Sort of an array of fans next to like some energy plant to spin up the fans. And then there's some kind of material that somehow the carbon the air is pushed through and the carbon attaches itself. And then that material has to be replaced, right? The only thing that I came away, and I didn't do any research into it, was like, wow, that seems like a lot of energy to generate this stuff. So, Stefan, this is your world. I mean, is this for real? Like, do these things work? What does it look like? What's the current state of the technology now?
Yeah. So what you're referring to is both what we call carbon capture and storage or sequestration. And then there's also separately direct air capture. And they are similar technologies with the goal of addressing two different issues in trying to tackle climate change. So ITIF just published a recent report on this that I would encourage your listeners to look into if they're interested in this further. But essentially, CCS is capturing those emissions at the smokestack. If you work in the climate world, you'll often hear the bathtub analogy. So imagine a bathtub with the faucet on, and the water is the carbon dioxide, and the bathtub is the capacity of the atmosphere to hold a certain amount of CO2 before runaway climate change or these climate impacts really impact or we start to feel those. So CCS is essentially CCS is essentially putting a bag over that, over the faucet, for example. Investing in things like wind, solar, nuclear, other low carbon options, that's turning the faucet from full pour to half pour or whatever. It's reducing the flow. Direct air capture is removing that water that's already in the bathtub and removing it permanently. So the technology you're referring to uses a calcium hydroxide solution, which is well perfected. For example, U.S. submarines in the 1950s to filter out poisonous levels of carbon dioxide used a similar system.
Oh, that's where it comes from.
Yep. So again, this is a good connection between U.S. government funding for early stage technologies, and then the subsequent uses of those technologies. In the 1950s, when I don't know if it was DARPA or whoever the Defense Department, probably someone in MIT and the federal government designing nuclear submarines, they designed this system to, again, filter out poisonous carbon dioxide. There was no way in which they could have imagined that it would be later used to remove or sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I mean, climate change was just not an issue that anyone was thinking about. So this is, I think, a good example of early stage U.S. technology or investment in U.S. technology later bearing fruit that can then be used in sort of novel applications. But back to the actual technology itself, what you were referring to, I'm sure it might have been either a picture or a sort of a mock-up of so Bill Gates through the Breakthrough Institute, and he's been a big leader here in this world, putting both a lot of vital sort of venture capital, sort of venture philanthropic money, I think it's referred to, into some of these technologies and startups and companies, and then also funding a lot of the research that's critical. But for direct air capture, what you essentially have to do is use large industrial arrays of fans to move ambient air over this solution that captures the carbon. the carbon dioxide from the air. The problem is, and to your point of a lot of energy usage, is even though carbon emissions are too high in the atmosphere, they're still 0.04% of the ambient air. So
0.04. Jesus.
0.04, yeah. So when you hear parts per million,
tiniest
for example,
amount.
It's very small. So imagine, imagine you have 1,000 grains of sand, and they're all white except for 420 grains of sand that are red. Imagine the difficulty of kind of finding those or locating those. So, and it's diffuse as well. So it's spread evenly throughout the atmosphere, throughout the air, the ambient air at sea level atmosphere pressure. So that's where the difficulty and that's where the energy load comes in, is bringing that carbon from the air and capturing it. And then there's a process by which you have to essentially break off. You form a chemical reaction, and then you have to break apart the chemical reaction. And then when you break apart the chemical reaction, you're able to get what's called like a pure stream of carbon dioxide. But it's not over there yet. So what you have to do is, now you have this stream of carbon dioxide, you have to do something with it. Obviously, you don't want to put it back into the air. You want to sequester it in some kind of permanent state.
Is this stream of carbon dioxide like in a liquid form? Or is it just still gaseous? It's still, now you got gas.
Yeah, it starts as a gas, and then you have to apply, well, sorry, I should back up. It's a hydroxide solution. So it's actually kind of like a water or a liquid base. Okay. And then what you do is you have to break it apart, and then you get the gas. CO2 becomes a gas again, and then you have to condense it into essentially a liquid. A liquid
by like a cooling mechanism of some type, or like
pressure and cooling. Yep.
Oh my God. Okay. That's why this operation, if you saw a picture of it, there's like all these tubes, and like it's like behind the array of fans is like some massive like industrial chemical process happening. But that's a lot of steps.
It is certainly a very large industrial chemical process. Thankfully, it is one that we have the technology and the know-how to do. So the first called demonstration scale project, I'm sure you saw in some of your research, is the Climeworks facility in Iceland.
Climeworks, yes.
Yeah. So it's a 4,000 metric tons of CO2 per year, which is it's the largest to date, but it's still much too small for what we need to be doing to avert climate change. But they have an interesting technology in that they're able to use geothermal, low carbon geothermal heat and electricity. This process requires both heat and electricity, which makes it a little more difficult in the siting needs. So it needs the heat and the electricity, preferably low carbon, captures the CO2 from the air, purifies it and condenses it, and then injects it underground in a process known as permanent geological sequestration, by which the carbon dioxide reacts with essentially minerals in the subsurface, and then forms limestone. And limestone is essentially a permanent, on timescales that we care about as humans who will be alive, that is more than enough. So yeah, their technology has been proven. It's been proven at scale, but it needs to obviously, we need, I think estimates are that we need to scale this technology 50% per year between now and 2050 to get to the levels that experts say that we need to be at to avert climate change.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, and that's like, okay. And then, so when you talk about that, it's not just the build, it's almost like you have to scale the operations of building these. You have to like have the factories that make these things, that make the parts for these things, assemble the parts. And then you mentioned the siting, like geothermal, a good cheap energy, electricity source, heat source. That's going to be the challenge. So that's part of your report, right? On TIF, you're arguing for better, faster permitting processes, and as part of this area. Well, that's interesting. Do they have a good sense to climb more separate? I should talk to them, but do they have a good sense of like areas that they could improve if they could get to volume, or like new, like this areas of this whole process that they could get more efficient? I'm sure they do. I'm sure they have a backlog of a list.
Yeah, I think the technology can certainly be improved. There's always efficiency gains. You're working against the laws of thermodynamics to a certain extent, because it's still going to be an energy intensive process regardless of how good the technologies get. I think where you're seeing innovation is going to be in the process side. So how easily and quickly can you and cheaply can you sequester the carbon there? So there are some very sort of innovative new direct air capture companies out there that try to reduce the energy burden by using ambient airflows and pressure differentials to move ambient air over that similar CO2 absorbent. So there's a company, I'm blanking on the name right now, but I can pull it up. But it's they essentially are trying to perfect a process by which they put small scale direct air capture facilities on commercial air handlers. So buildings in New York City, for example, they move a lot of air through the building, and they have these huge
Garages,
boxes on top, yeah, that are essentially pulling this air out. And it would not be essentially very difficult to attach some kind of capture process on that, where you're using, and it wouldn't impact the air handler. It's still removing the air that it needs to. You know, there are other ideas. There are ideas of particularly siting these direct air capture facilities in areas where they can take again advantage of natural wind flows.
Is there there's the modular? So just on the fan, sorry to interrupt. Is there a modular component, like a pre-capture component that would go on these fans that then they can then take to the further processing plant down, you know, by the geothermal location?
Yeah, I think that's the idea.
Okay.
You know, the issue I think that they're having, for example, the air handler folks, is what to do with the actual captured carbon once you have it. You know, you're not going to be piping that into the bedrock of New York City, for example. So you have to come up with some way of putting that carbon somewhere. Some other ideas are totally sort of outside of this fan-based array system. And in our recent report, we try to use a taxonomy essentially of technologies where there's what we dub active carbon management solutions, which are your carbon capture and storage and utilization in your direct air capture. And then there's sort of natural based solutions, which folks are probably familiar with, is planting trees, restoring wetlands and things like that. And then there's sort of a hybrid approach where you use the low energy benefits of Mother Nature and combine it with the active carbon management side of carbon capture. So there's a company out there called Charm, where they take waste materials. So think of like corn husks and things like agricultural waste. They pyrolyze it, which means that they apply heat and energy to it in a oxygen-free environment, which doesn't emit carbon dioxide because there's no oxygen to react with, and it turns it in essentially to like a carbon sludge. And then they take that sludge and they're able to do things with it, like pump it underground to permanently sequester it, or use it in things that sort of advanced new technologies. For example, sustainable aviation fuel is sort of the new idea of what to do with some of this captured carbon. So yeah, I don't want to leave the listeners with this idea that the sort of Climeworks is the only way.
Right. This is compelling. I mean, that's compelling too. The I can never even see these chemical terms, but pyrolysis. Yeah. I'm just fascinated that there's all these options that they're doing behind the scenes. When do you, as you guys keep looking at these sort of options in the active carbon management and in the hybrid approaches, where do you see like something breaking out into scale? Like that's the other challenge, right? It's like, okay, we can do this, but there's all these other factors that keep, maybe there's not even a market big enough to, like, not enough underground, wells to stuff this stuff in. Like there's always something that's holding something back, but do you track, I guess, what might actually break through faster? Who's closest to that zone where it becomes like a big business, something to seriously take into consideration? Like give Tesla the example.
Yeah, we in writing this report and researching this report, we spoke to other folks in the community and some of the we reached out to some companies and got some feedback and so forth. And what we hear consistently is that they are confident in the technology. They're confident in their ability to scale the technology. They're not worried about this isn't like batteries where there's kind of ongoing concerns about critical minerals and the shortage of critical minerals. The main inputs for these are, again, steel to make the boxes, calcium hydroxide solutions, which are commonly made and have a low carbon footprint themselves, and heat and energy and a place to store it. So what the big concern is, how are we going to really pay for this? Like most things in society, sadly, it comes down to kind of designing and developing financing structures for these companies that makes it valuable for them to get into the space. Currently, we're seeing this as more of a voluntary, altruistic market, which isn't something that we are necessarily disheartened by, because as anyone knows, the early 90s and into the 2000s, for example, solar technology was seen as a high-end, enviro, altruistic technology, and now it's very mainstream and very cheap. Tesla is another example. So those that are willing to pay the premium for things like direct air capture are going to be the leaders in this space, probably for the next decade, is what our estimate is. But we hope that through two or three mechanisms, essentially. One is going to have to be continued, at least in the United States and elsewhere, continued, and particularly in the absence, to go back to your first point, the carbon tax point. A carbon tax is beautiful as an instrument because it facilitates innovation and cost savings and carbon savings throughout the entire economic structure and process. So if you put a price on it, then people will instinctively look for ways in which to reduce that tax
Beat
burden.
that, right?
Exactly.
Right.
So I'm with you there. Certainly, I support a carbon tax just personally because I think of its simplicity and I think of its carbon benefits and societal benefits and so forth.
It puts a price on this sort of externality that everyone's still wondering about, right?
Exactly. And not only is it a price on externality, it's a market signal that shows and tells others, innovators, so the Climeworks of the world can be, hey, there's money to be made in getting this carbon out of the atmosphere, or companies paying me to, if you're carbon capture and storage, you put it on the smokestack. Hey, there's a company that there's companies out there that are willing to pay to not have this carbon emitted.
Right. Invest in the capital to get my equipment on, because then that reduces your carbon tax by X number. And they can do the math and they can say, okay, yeah, that's just better allocation of cash. I mean, it's that simple, really, except for the fact that getting a tax passed in our country's political climate is difficult. So I see, like, the foundation you work for does talk a lot about credits, like, right? It's like tax credits is usually something a little bit easier to consider.
Yeah. And I would have to say, in today's political environment, it's certainly hard to imagine having the political capital, let alone the votes, to implement a national carbon price. What I do see being possible is, and we've already seen this, I think, in the I wanted to get into the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was signed in November of 2021. There's up to about $12.5 billion there, both for early stage RD&D, but also, more importantly, we think, late development, deployment of CCS technology and DAC technology throughout the United States. And it's designed in a really innovative way to pair the facilities with either local off-takers or local low carbon energy resources, as well as to address certain environmental justice concerns that might be that exist. So we're big fans of the money and the spent in the structure of the funding that was provided through the infrastructure bill. But yeah, again, going back to kind of how to make this pencil out, there's an IRS tax credit that was passed in 2018. The 45, it's called 45Q based on its location in the IRS tax code. And 45Q is a tax credit payment for capturing carbon from a smokestack. It's about $50 a ton right now. If you bury it and permanently sequester, it's $35 a ton if you use it in what's called an enhanced oil recovery process. We can get into that if you're interested, but basically everyone we talk to for this report and in the community believes that is too low currently to really incentivize the large capital expenditure for these projects. Additionally, 45Q is only out to 12 years. So that means if you invest in this multi-billion-dollar project, you can only monetize the tax credits out for 12 years, which is a problem. There's some other issues around kind of the structure of how the tax credits operate. So that kind of led us to believe that, and we're not the only ones to say this or to coin this analogy, but others in the community are really talking about carbon removal as essentially a public good, a public service. And public goods, as you know, suffer from the fact that nobody wants to pay for them. And that's the one actor that's really able to address public good concerns is the government. So we might be entering a world in which once the technology is really proven and able to scale, and they say, hey, we can't get anyone to buy this because we don't have the markets for it, the government may then have to step in the same way that we pay for sewers. We socialize the cost of sewers. We socialize the cost of garbage in most cities. The government essentially having to establish a carbon cleanup fund or something of that sort. I don't think we're there yet, and we're not sort of advocating that as the primary policy and focus, but it's possible to imagine that is essentially where these projects and these companies are gonna have to go and rely on.
I mean, these, especially with the larger the direct air stuff, I mean, these are large installations, right? Like large asset investments. So where your money's locked in for 10, 20 years, right? Like you have to think of it in those time scales. And so if there's no clarity or the credit is too low, I mean, and getting investors VC money for some of this stuff is next to impossible. They want their money in 4 or 5 years. They want to know when are you reaching profitability so they can take their cut back out with profit, right? So, but is this like the general pace for things like this, where like the government just sort of inches their way into something, and then everybody complains that wasn't enough, and they get some studies proving that it's not really making a measurable difference, and then you go another step further? Like it just sort of, this is the incremental process of policy making.
I think you're right, and again, I think looking to the recent past of the renewable technologies that have been a success, particularly solar in the United States, and to a certain degree wind. I mean, the cost of solar has gone down, close to 10,000 times since 1972, right? And that was fundamentally government-led research and development, corporate interests in early stage corporate interests for very expensive and high-tech applications. And then, we got our first public policy really to support the commercial application of solar in the 90s, or we didn't get it to the 90s really. And that was a period in which, there wasn't a huge interest in addressing climate change, and there wasn't even a huge interest in trying to, monetize or profit from these technologies. But yeah, I think that's a good analogy. And we're already sort of I think in the sort of second renaissance of a lot of particularly carbon management technologies. The first was the late Bush administration, the early Obama administration. So if you're interested in that history, I think folks can probably remember the clean coal days. So clean coal was essentially an idea of continuing to build and burn coal-fired power plants with the application of carbon capture and storage, so that most of the carbon dioxide would be captured and then sequestered. Hence the clean coal. That was proven to be was proven to be difficult for a few reasons. Again, the issue of monetizing that cost,
monetizing the storage and the extraction pieces.
The capex. I mean, it's $1 billion. You've got probably a $2 billion coal plant, and you're talking about adding an extra 500 to maybe $1 billion in capital expenditure on top of that. And who pay? And in the United States, most of this would have been paid for by electric ratepayers. So that
bonds,
you obviously
so
don't
like
want
a third or a half of the cost of the plant. Now you're on top of it, right? Mm-hmm. How do you get the community to get behind that? Oh, okay.
So I think now we're kind of in the second renaissance, where some of the failures, to put it bluntly, of the previous DOE projects and processes have been thought out and recognized. And I think the community is a little more they're a little more gun shy in that sense, and they don't want to you don't want to be the next corporate government funded corporate failure, not to name names, but I think to a certain extent as well, that once folks realize that this is a mature marketplace, then we're going to start to see some recent activity, and we're already seeing that activity. There's exciting news you probably saw this, but Stripe, alongside a handful of other technology companies. Stripe is a global payments process company, and they've taken a really interesting and active role in carbon removal. Microsoft is another.
Did you say Stripe or Strife?
Stripe. Yes, Stripe. And okay. So Stripe, in 2019, what was considered a groundbreaking announcement, they announced that they were going to invest $1 million into carbon removal technologies. Well, less than 2.5 years later, they announced that they're going to invest $925 million. So,
okay.
And these are serious people, and
that's real money here.
That's real money there, and they're doing it actually in a very innovative way. It's called an advanced market commitment, an AMC, and the way that it operates is they go out and they say it was first perfected in vaccine development. So the problem with vaccines, particularly vaccines like malaria vaccines, is that the Pfizers and the large biopharmaceutical companies of the world don't necessarily have a clear market incentive to invest the research and development time into a malaria vaccine, for example, because the folks who are going to end up needing that are likely poor. So what you have is this market discontinuity where there's someone who has the research and development skill, but they're not going to invest in either the time and effort or the rollout of this because the market isn't there. So what the AMC does is it puts up the money and promises this huge pool of money for the companies that can prove out the technology.
They put the prize money of the return.
It's kind of like a prize, but I think it operates better in the sense that it's going to try to pool as many successful companies into the market to chase that money.
They're guaranteeing the customer base will be there to a certain degree.
Right.
Oh wow! And that's what Stripe's doing with this cash.
Yeah, exactly. So I think this might be something that the federal government can even try to establish. Federal procurement standards are a thing, and this administration has actually tried to introduce measures to highlight low carbon procurement standards for products, so it can kind of operate as a way. And we're actually lucky on our recent report launch to have Representative Paul Tonko from New York State join us, and he introduced an innovative bill alongside his colleague Scott Peters from California that would require would essentially set up a federal advanced market commitment. So it would require the DOE to set up a fund to pool out increasing amount of carbon at a lower and lower price per ton over the next 15 years. So again, I'm not sure about the chances of its passing, and hopefully if we can get something before the midterms, there might be an opportunity to slot that in somewhere. But in its current iteration, the bill would essentially set up something similar where this money is promised and the government has to go out and secure these tons, and that builds that ecosystem. And I think building the ecosystem of firms is what's really critical.
On the actual carbon piece, the material itself, are there manufacturing processes that could use it? That like do we have to just inject it into the ground? I mean, where are the parts where this compound could be used?
Yeah, no, I think that's where I'm excited. It will probably never be as large as the need to permanently sequester the carbon, but there are some really exciting companies out there that are using captured ambient carbon or captured smokestack carbon to make things like diamonds, for example, industrial diamonds that are used in drill bits to cut materials. There are companies, that's a very high-end, high-process application, but there are other things you can make. If you combine captured carbon essentially with a clean source of hydrogen, you can make essentially synthetic fuels that are what's called drop-in ready. So if you have a synthetic fuel, you're using captured carbon plus hopefully green hydrogen of some sort, and you can offset. It's not carbon negative, but it's carbon neutral in the sense that you're plus all the energy that takes to make it. If that pencils out, you're able to essentially use that fuel as you would a virgin barrel of jet fuel or something like that. There are other applications that I think are exciting. I mean, even there's talk of using captured carbon in process material. I think the one we see today, the one that I like and I'm excited about, it has a number of benefits, is the use of captured carbon in building materials.
Yeah,
so
cement.
Cement, yep. So there's a company, Carbcrete.
Yeah, I had them on the show.
Oh, you did? Yeah.
Had the owner on the show, right? Yes. Do you keep an eye on that one too? That's another option.
Yeah, certainly. And they have multiple benefits. I'm sure he got into this, but you also use less. Because it makes the material stronger. You use less concrete overall, and it's a permanent storage application. So I think that's another example.
And apparently, I remember it makes it actually stronger, more durable. Just the chemical makeup of this stuff. What do you do? So you're at the dinner party, and then what do you do with the criticism that come from like, well, you're using more energy for all of this process, right? So it's like the argument against EVs. It's like, well, you're just plugging the EVs into the electric grid, and the electric grid is still then generating all those electrons, all the energy to fill up those batteries. And that's got to come from fossil fuels for the most part. How do you help navigate around that? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that is a real criticism, and I don't want to hand wave it away. And first of all, I should have said this at the top, but clearly continuing on and investing in the proven mitigation technologies that we have today, primarily wind and solar, and batteries. Alongside, I don't want to give our nuclear brothers a short shrift. I am pro-nuclear. I think it's got some issues, but
so am I actually. Look at it.
But we need to decarbonize the grid, and we need to decarbonize transportation, and we need to decarbonize industry and as much as we can. But sadly, we're just not. There's going to be two things. There's going to be sectors that are very, very difficult to decarbonize. We're currently at ITIF, we're researching a we're researching the emissions that are in the plastics supply chain in the United States, and we're pretty far along. And we've found out that just based on cost, but primarily actually technology, it's going to be very difficult to fully decarbonize the U.S. petrochemical plastics industry, just because of the process. Plastic is embodied oil and gas, basically. So if we're going to deal with those, and those are a significant portion of global emissions, we're going to need carbon capture and storage. We're going to need direct air capture to remove those remaining emissions. The cost benefit.
Yeah, I was gonna reflect on that. I think that the on the plastic side, at the end, we have to continuously try to improve all of these systems, like without judgment of whether one will make it or not, because we're sort of learning even more as we go along, right? And then over time, if we rely on the grid more to power our cars, power our homes, power these things, then at least it centralizes the challenge of how we're generating the energy into like the municipalities. And then we can focus much easier dealing with that over time. But on the plastic side of thing, there's still compelling arguments there for plastics. I'm not like anti-plastic per se. It's probably just more anti-plastic for single-use things, when there's alternatives for that. But like I have steel cast sewer thing in my home, and it's corroded and it's already backed up a couple of times. And I'm getting to the point where I'm thinking we might need to just dig up the front yard and get that thing replaced. Apparently those things they're cast iron. They only last 30 some years, right? I'm going to put plastic. I want the thing that's going to last 100 years for that reason, so that they don't have to keep coming back 30 years with trucks and the energy, burning the fossil fuels to dig it up, put this thing down in there, right? Like it makes sense there, right? Totally. Using plastics that have been reconstituted for piping inside when you build new homes. Like you don't need beautiful white plastic for your sewer line as you build these homes. Like that's like there's uses for this. We just have to get more optimal, right?
And we're specifically looking at PVC, polyvinyl chlorine, as that kind of plastic. Particularly one was to narrow down the scope of the research study, but we were interested in PVC. I don't know if this is necessarily an accepted use of the term, but it does, that new septic system or whatever water system in your house, that's going to embody that carbon for 100 years or more, or probably longer. We've dug up PVC pipe that we put in the ground in the 50s, and it still looks kind of basically like new. If we can make that actual PVC less carbon intensive or capture the emissions that are associated with its production, then that's better than like you said, digging up all this steel. Steel has tremendous emissions in and of itself as well. So but yeah, back to the kind of broader carbon management issues that we see. It will require a lot of technology, or it will require a lot of energy, and it will require a lot of space and resources, but we see it essentially as complementary to what's already going on. And we believe that we need to rapidly decarbonize the electric grid. In the United States, I like to think, and around the world, but primarily the United States and the European Union, and then probably 10 years behind or 15 years behind that is the major developing world. But in the next decade, we really need to take this opportunity to focus on decarbonizing the grid. Every coal plant and natural gas plant that we're able to substitute reliably and cost effectively with wind and solar and batteries and other technologies, we should be doing. In the next decade, what we're really going to need to do is we're going to need to invest and build out the proven technologies we have today for sort of the large scale capture. And then beyond that, we can kind of deal with the remaining, in the 2040s and the 2050s, we can deal with the how to decarbonize air travel or something. And I don't want to downplay the need to really radically reduce emissions, but if we can get to a place where we're dealing with 80% of the emissions and we have to figure out what to do with that remaining 20, I'd much rather be there than where we are today. And we shouldn't let this idea that we need to think about all 100%, we need to eliminate fully 100% of emissions. We shouldn't let that, we think, be a barrier to really doing something today, because otherwise we're just not going to get to either position.
Yeah, I generally have there is an issue, I guess, in the environmental world, the environmental advocacy world, where there's some despondency in there. They've been beat up pretty bad. No one's really listened. And they're doing a lot of told you so's at this point, giving, like, we are actually seeing the manifestation of carbon in the atmosphere. It's obvious. It's all there. And it's going to get worse if we don't do something about it. But I have about as much use for somebody who's thinking, well, we can't decarbonize at all, so why try, from the person who's just also denying that climate is still not real science in 2022. Like those groups, just, you might as well not, bother even dealing with them, because it's just, they're not going to be of any help, right? They're the same. It's the same version of the person, right?
Yeah.
In my mind. How do you feel? So knowing where you've been through, and you've been at this for 10 years, like, what's your current sentiment of where we are in this progression? Like, is the future getting brighter, or is the future still dangerously tenuous if we don't get some things right soon? Like, where are you in that zone?
I think the future's, and might be unsatisfying for you and the listeners, but I think the future is still sort of unsettled in a lot of ways. I think we really have the technologies available today to rapidly and effectively decarbonize, but I also think to a certain extent we don't have we don't have all of those technologies, I should say. I think causes of optimism, the thing that I'm incredibly heartened by is the rapid, I think the story of this decade, when we look back in 2030, in big climate news and big energy news, is going to be the rapid adoption of electric vehicles. They are in the United States and around the world are blowing expectations. Of course, that is probably related to a certain extent, gas prices and energy politics and so on. And there are going to be supply issues and so forth. But I think we're going to look back on our projections, and they're going to be woefully behind. I think the same thing still with renewable energy resources as well. I think where it's still unsettled is those industrial sectors. In the United States, there's 30% of emissions come from the industrial sector. In China, it's even greater. The European Union is a little lower, but they still have heavy industry there too. And we shouldn't be under we need this heavy industry. We shouldn't be under the perception, or at least I believe that the United States, needs a robust industrial sector, not only for the employment and economic impact, but national security implications and so forth. So yeah, I think 30% of emissions in the United States and elsewhere is still significant. So that's where it's unsettled. Are we really going to commit to reducing those emissions in a way that that essentially allows for those resources to either remain operable or really addresses their emissions in a meaningful way? We can't just substitute away from iron. We can't just instantly substitute away from things like iron and steel and so forth. So,
well, the future's unwritten, and I think, like, the one thing we can count on is humanity is notoriously bad at predicting the future, right? Despite
we're bad
all
at predicting,
the
but we're good at coming up with solutions to big problems. And I think that's kind of where the environmental community gets down on itself, is they sometimes underestimate the ability for humans to solve problems, whether that's water issues or food issues or you name it. And I think the last I think that's where the cause of optimism is brightest, is to think about the sort of ingenuity there. So yeah, we're bad at predicting the future, but we're decently good at coming up with workable solutions to issues that we face as a species.
Yeah. So don't give up. Keep going. Right. Stefan, man, let's stop there. I really thank you for sharing these insights. And then this climate, the report is called, I have it right here, Active Carbon Management, Critical Tools in the Climate Toolbox. And I think it covers everything we just even talked about, all the different areas that should improve. So, and where we need to have more federal cohesion, national policy. It is a national security issue. I think the best thing I can feel about 2022 versus 10 years ago, I guess when you started in this space, is that everyone is actually taking it pretty seriously now. So that's huge progress in and of itself, right? So thank you. If somebody wants to reach out to you, best way, just go to ITIF. Is it ITIF, or how do you guys say it? ITIF or the foundation? What do you guys usually?
we call it ITIF. Yeah.
ITIF. Okay.
Yeah. I'm also on Twitter, skoester8, Twitter, and yeah, probably the best way is on the ITIF staff page. Welcome any folks who have questions or outreach or so forth. So, but yeah, thank you so much. This was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. You too. Take care, and thank you guys for listening or watching on the YouTube channel. I appreciate that very much. Take care, everybody.
Visit throughthenoise.us for more episodes and subscribe to our newsletter. This show is produced by Through the Noise Consulting, uniting external communications and internal IT functions to ensure data and privacy are protected while creating innovative communications platforms. Want to start your own podcast? We can help. Visit getthroughthenoise.com to learn more.